Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're talking with Carolyn Wright, Seattle-based poet. Her new book is the groundbreaking anthology in Lost Horse Press's Human Rights series, Raising Lilly Ledbetter, Women Poets Occupy the Workspace. Her other 9 books and chapbooks of poetry include Season of Mangoes and Brainfire, which won the Blue Lynx Prize and American Book Award, A Change of Maps, and Manya Klepto, the Book of Yulin. She also has 4 volumes of poetry and translation from Spanish and Bengali. A Seattle native who studied with Elizabeth Bishop, Richard Hugo, and William Stafford, Wright has lived in Chile, Brazil, India, and Bangladesh, and is fluent in Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and Bengali. After teaching at universities and colleges nationwide, she serves on the faculty of the Northwest Institute of Literary Arts Would-Be Writers Workshop MFA program, and also teaches for Seattle's Richard Hugo House. A poem of hers has appeared in the Best American Poetry 2009 and the Pushcart Prizes of 2010. A contributing editor for the Pushcart Prizes and a senior editor for Lost Horse Press, Wright has received grants and fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the NEA for Culture, and Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture. Welcome, Carolyn.
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me.
I'm very, very pleased that we're getting to talk today and very excited to be able to hear some of your poetry and to talk about the books and your latest, I'm sure will be prize-winning collection of Women Poets Occupy the Workspace. Could we begin today with a poem by you?
Sure. All right. I think I'll go to the book of mine that was published by Lost Horse Press in 2006. Here's a poem called Return to Seattle, Bastille Day. Return to Seattle, Bastille Day. No difference in the gray gulls sobbing like women who circled the tumbrils, scaffold silhouettes of fur. The same sky lowers over the channel. The plane follows it down like an obsession, guillotine blade of sun on water. All of this for what? Walking the green neighborhoods with names like gracious women, Madrona, Magnolia, rain telling its stories on the ponds, rainbows fracturing in oil slicks. How could I go back to where I first took my age between my hands like a lover's face and said, this far, no farther, then moved from one coastline to the next, as if I had no winter and no home. For years it was easy, nothing to answer for what went beyond the weather, too soon to give up on the body or lose myself in the blue selectivity of dream. Now, what stands between me and the long frontier with winter? A father sleepwalking among ohms and voltmeters, the electric smell of metal. A brother face down in the soft gray light of the calculus. A sister vanished from the glass house of her thoughts before anyone could have grown into her name. My mother, 1945, stepping from the Armistice Day prop plane with her unchanged face. Light off the Cascade rain front, troubling her memory with its danger. Years before she could blame herself for everything.
Oh, Carolyn, thank you so much for reading that. I'm wondering if coming from so many different landscapes back to Seattle, the place of your birth and growing up, made you somehow exquisitely sensitive to the environment, the plants, the weather. Do you think you were attuned to it in a different way from having come so far?
I think so, because traveling, living elsewhere in other life zones and other climates, weather patterns, geographical landscapes, made me more aware. Because when you come home, as it were, you can look at your home as you would a new place. It enabled me to see Seattle and the whole Pacific Northwest, the West Coast, this particular sort of life zone, which is now called, people are now calling it Cascadia. It enabled me to appreciate it even more than I did before, because when I was a kid living here and my family didn't do a whole lot of traveling, my parents were both from basically New York and New Jersey, and so they were sturdy indoor types. And I was quite restless after I finished my undergraduate schooling here to travel elsewhere, and I certainly was able to do that. And so all my returns to Seattle and ultimately moving back here 10 years ago enabled me to appreciate the beauty of this region even more than I did before.
Your undergraduate work at the University of Washington, is that
actually I was at Seattle University.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you for the correction.
I just said here, I was in the Humanities Honors Program at Seattle University, which I often tell people, when people ask, well, what was the most challenging thing you did in graduate school? I said, well, my most challenging years of graduate school were my freshman and sophomore years, undergraduate years at Seattle University in the Humanities Honors Program, which was a sort of a chronologically oriented classes. We were all together in one group. 3 classes, literature, history, and thought, which was philosophy. And we started with, let's say, the pre-Socratic philosophers. In philosophy, we were studying ancient Greece, and then in literature, we were doing the plays and the poetry and all of that of Greece, and we worked up through the Middle East, the whole Mesopotamian region. We went into Rome, we went through the Middle Ages and up through modern history up to basically post-World War II in history, philosophy, and literature. And it was amazing because you could see the whole integration of thought and of action, of the development of economies and countries and literary trends and genres, and all of that together in one program. And it was very demanding. We had to write a great deal and think a great deal, discuss a great deal. We started out with 20 in the program, and by the end there were 12.
My goodness, well, I'm glad you were among them.
Yeah, it was amazing.
I think that Seattle University is a fine school with a rigorous agenda for students and missions for the world. So I'm wondering 2 things. One is when you studied with Elizabeth Bishop, but hold that thought. And the second thing is, well, there's 3. Were you writing poetry during this program that was so rigorous? And thirdly...
yes, I was.
Okay, and we'll talk about that. And then thirdly, did all those studies encourage you to do all that traveling that you've done throughout your career? So we have 3 things going: Elizabeth Bishop studies, writing poetry while you were in this rigorous program, and where the urge to travel came from. Would you like to tell us about those?
All right, well, I'll start with the urge to travel, which I had basically while I was at CLU. I was certainly reading and scanning across all of history, much of human history, and across many continents and civilizations. I applied for a Fulbright Hays study grant. My mother had encouraged me to apply for England because England was very prestigious. Well, we know one rather well-known poet who had a Fulbright Hays study grant to England. That was Sylvia Plath, right? Well, we know what happened to her, but I was being a little more practical, I think, because I figured I probably, coming from the West Coast, which at that point was pretty far from the East and the Ivy League colleges, I figured I didn't have a whole lot of opportunity, a whole lot of chance to get one of the 10 slots for England. Meanwhile, there were 26 slots for what they called the American Republics, which involved countries mainly in Latin America. So I applied for Latin America, where I had 3 different choices of countries, and where fluency in Spanish or Portuguese was required. And I had taken 6 years of Spanish in junior high and high school, so that helped. Actually, I had also done a correspondence course through the University of Washington with a professor. He was actually the head of the Romance Languages department, and he actually did my language recommendation for the Fulbright application. And he actually had invited me. His name was Marcelino Peñuelas. He was from Spain. He invited me after the year in Chile. Chile was the country I ended up selecting, and I went to Chile. But after that, I returned to the University of Washington at his invitation to pursue a master's in Romance languages with a teaching assistantship. So it was while I was there at the University of Washington doing that master's degree in Spanish, in Romance languages, that I saw that Elizabeth Bishop was coming to be the Theodore Rutke visiting poet that spring quarter.
What year was that?
That was 1973. She had been there prior. She had made one previous visit. She stayed 2 quarters in, it was either 1966, 65 or 66. That was well before I was there at the University of Washington. But in spring quarter of 73, she taught a workshop, and I was in it. I didn't really know all that much about her. I think I was dimly aware she had been in Brazil because her collected poems that had been published at the time included several poems about Brazil. Part of my time in Chile, I was there for a year on this grant, and I had met some people while traveling in the south of Chile who said, "Oh, if you can do it, you should go to Brazil during Carnival," and which, of course, is in February, early February. So I made it my business to get to Bahia, the city of Sao Salvador, Bahia, during Carnival, and that was the most amazing experience. I learned just enough Portuguese at that point from Spanish to get by. So then I come back to the U.S. At the end of my year in Chile, and when I'm in Elizabeth Bishop's workshop, I happened to mention something about Brazil, and her eyes just lit up. She was sort of galvanized by that, and she said, "So you know Brazil?" She invited me into her office afterwards to talk about Brazil. So I sat in Elizabeth Bishop's office with her, and she asked me about my time in Brazil. And, of course, my time in Brazil was very different from hers.
You and I both know from our background in poetry who Elizabeth Bishop is. But
yes.
But for any listeners who may not know, at the time you were studying with her, she had already won the Pulitzer, the National Book Award. Any other awards that you know of?
I'm not sure if she won the Neustadt Prize at that point. I think that was in 76. But she was highly renowned and was one of those poets whose practically every poem that she finished was first published in the New Yorker.
Right.
I knew that she was very, very famous, and so I was duly awed and a bit, not exactly intimidated, because she was actually she was very friendly and sort of unassuming in a way. She had this poetic presence. It was amazing, but it was very interesting to study with her because she had us writing in form, and which was not anything I experienced with any other teachers that I had. Most of the teachers I had, if they gave any prompts at all, any exercises to, give us something to write about, they just say, "Oh, well, bring a poem into class next time." We read quite a bit, and we wrote in form. And although nothing I produced at the time was really worth saving, the lessons I learned from her stayed with me even up until now, because what I do often when I teach is I try to impart to students what she imparted and have them learn a great deal of sort of the kind of discipline that, let's say, people studying music, they learn in composition classes. You learn to write a fugue, you learn to write a symphony, you learn to put together according to the various musical forms. When I was starting to write poetry, free verse was the default form, and that was all people did. You sort of learned how to break a line, and you learned how to have a kind of a surprising revelation at the end of a poem. But that was about it.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila Bender talks with Seattle-based poet Carolyn Wright about her poetry, her teaching, and her latest anthology project.
Can I ask you, because you studied with at least 2 other luminaries that you indicate in your bio, Richard Hugo and William Stafford, both from the Northwest, unlike Elizabeth Bishop, how their influences worked out in your poetry, and then we'll have you read a poem or two.
I think William Stafford, with whom I studied very early on at the first time, it was like in Port Townsend in the summer between high school and college, he imparted to me this sense of wonder, sort of the freshness of experience, of observing all that was around me, and just starting really simply, without any huge project, just write down whatever observation comes to you, and then allow whatever the inner movements going on to emerge from that. He has described that a great deal in his daily writing project, and also to come by the end of the poem to some kind of discovery. So I think that was one of the main sort of approaches that I gleaned from William Stafford. And then from Dick Hugo, I learned to, again, look around me and observe and then write about those triggering towns. But I think one of the things that I loved about Richard Hugo is that driving rhythm in his lines. I mean, he writes in blank verse. If you read his lines, there's this sort of driving iambic line. There's usually about 5 stresses to the line, and there's this sort of real momentum in his lines. And when I go back and read poems, I was writing back in the day when I would be reading through his books, and then I'd read a few poems, then I'd have to put the poems down and start writing, because there was something in the impetus of his language that just got me writing.
You have a huge background, so ready to hear another poem that comes right out of all your studies and experience.
Well, let's see. I have many things I could read. Maybe I'll do this. I have an alter ego called Eileen, who is the one who does all the mischievous things that Carolyn Wright would never be caught dead doing. But I am going to read a poem. There's the book of mine called Mania Klepto, the Book of Eileen. I'm going to read the poem in there that is Eileen's declaration about herself. And this was actually written on a return trip to Chile with a poet friend and collaborator of mine named Eugenia Toledo. And now Eugenia is from the same city in Chile where Pablo Neruda was born. They have the same hometown. It's called Temuco. And Eileen and I wrote this poem in Temuco. So it has some imagery that sounds a bit like Chile, at least to me. That area of Chile has a climate and weather not dissimilar to the Northwest. So this is Eileen Declares. I am not a woman. I am a force of nature. I am not a thundercloud or a cloud wall. I am a burst of incoming fire. I am not a fire base. I am a tangle of Himalayan blackberries covering the headland. I am not a dark plot to disentangle in the novel's final chapter. I am the last task crossed off the list on your nightstand. I am not the constellation of Cygnus or the Cruz del Sur. I am the cry of geese migrating by the wintry glow of cell towers. I am not the light of your life. I am the echo of generations painted on cave walls. I am not the mirror or the lamp. I am the first gleam along the continent's serrated blade. I am not the exile's transcontinental flight. I am a crystal chip swirling for years into the blue-green torment of glacial melt. I am not the natural child of silence and slow time. I am the lost offspring of a tilting shelf, a miscellany of obstreperous bells. I am not a whim of weather or the vicissitudes of birth. I am a woman straight and strong. I am not a force of nature. I am a woman.
Thank you, Carolyn. Wonderful.
That's Eileen, or maybe it's me.
Well, you said you both wrote it, so
yes,
it sounds like you were very in touch with your shadow, and there she is, and she's strong and mighty and loves the play of language.
And you may also hear a few echoes of John Keats and Pablo Neruda.
Excellent.
Which were just some echoes that came to me as Eileen was writing.
So Eileen reads poetry too.
Yes.
She does. That's great. Would you like to read another poem from yet another collection?
Here's a poem called The Conjure Woman. She blows on the crystal ball, tells me I can have anything. Hibiscus flowers, jacaranda wood charms, a powder from the Mercado Modelo that drives men wild. In the waiting room, the man I want drums his fingers, makes eyes at the honey-colored woman stirring something in the kitchen. Strands of blue pearls, passion flower lensu on her head. A little samba on the red floor tiles. Yemanja, sea goddess, smiles and waves her fishtail from the poster on the wall. The conjure woman turns her wedding rings around a long story about the sea. Bahia dialect, the hushed syllables, palm trees reflecting on the water, whole sentences I want to understand. Samba school drums at the corners, cachaça bottles passed around, women singing the carnival tune, Não se esqueça de mim, don't leave me, don't forget. My future, full of missing words, eavesdropping at the tables of the deaf, late afternoon smell of exhaustion. He's gone. Lady Yemanja laughs in the room above the kitchen. I cross the conjure woman's palm and go out. The whole town is in the streets, masked dancers drumming their true names from continents that still would fit together, embracing face to face like lovers in the salt and sweat of their sea-displacing passion. Fishermen drag in their nets and fall to their knees between the silver thighs of women. That's from the book Seasons of Mangoes and Brainfire, which
Great
was
title.
published by, basically by Links House Press, and then second edition, Eastern Washington University Press, Links House Books.
Well, I certainly feel the presence of a poet in that poem, with observations of knowing that our observations are sometimes the ones that others either let slide by, don't take the time to have. Really very powerful, for me, expression of being a poet in any landscape, but you use the one you're in beautifully.
Thank you.
Before we close, we really need to pay some attention to your latest endeavor, Raising Lilly Ledbetter, Women Poets Occupy the Workspace. Do you have a way of explaining the project, a little background, and tell us how it's doing now?
Lilly Ledbetter was the woman who had worked for many years for a famous tire and rubber company, Goodyear. I guess I can mention that on the air. But just before she was about to retire after nearly 20 years, she was slipped some documents anonymously by a coworker that showed that she had been paid significantly less than her male counterparts with the same job title and responsibilities for most of her career. In 1998, when she was taking early retirement, when she learned about this, she was shocked. She filed a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Commission, and it went to trial, and it worked its way up through the courts. Finally, the Supreme Court took it on. She lost because they said, well, you should have filed this within 180 days of the first instance of pay inequity, the first paycheck that demonstrated pay inequity. Well, that could not possibly have been because she didn't know about it. She didn't know about it. It had been going on for over probably 15 or so years of the 20 years that she worked there. And so she lost in court, but Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was incensed at this and sort of basically challenged the Congress to take this up. So The very first piece of legislation that Barack Obama signed when he was inaugurated in 2009 was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which basically said that every check, every unequal paycheck would start the process again so that you didn't have to know about it the first time if your pay was unequal. So that was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. Well, I was hearing about this in 2009 and speaking with Christine Holbert, who's the founding editor, publisher, and book designer extraordinaire of Lost Horse Press. And she and I are really great buddies and collaborators. And since she had published the book of mine, A Change of Maps, in 2006, in 2009, she said, we really ought to do something else together. What do you have in mind? And I started talking about Lilly Ledbetter and the Fair Pay Act and thinking we should do an anthology about women and work, because women have always had the challenges of having to work much harder than men to get the same pay or less pay, and they're often preferred as employees because employers can pay them less. Let's do something about women and work, because I want to know more about the kinds of work that women do. And actually, Eugenia Toledo, with whom I traveled to Chile before, she and I worked together on this we began in 2012, put out a call for submissions, and we began receiving a lot of poems from women all over the country and all over the world. So that's how it began. We all had our own stories about our own women in our family who had worked and experienced some injustice and inequity in their own working lives. I've been the poet professor who travel around the country with one visiting position after another. So I had been very interested in work issues and employment issues for a long time. So that's how this anthology got started. We're going to be giving a number of readings in this region, in Seattle, around the Pacific Northwest, and then I already have invitations that I have to start planning for California, New York State, Colorado, other places where a number of the contributors live in the region, and so we can organize some events. And I've done a proposal for a reading at the next big Associated Writers and Writing Programs conference, which is going to be in Los Angeles next year in the spring.
I want to be sure that people know how to find out more information about the anthology and about your work. So give us some websites.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want to find out more about Raising Lilly Ledbetter, Women Poets Occupy the Workspace, go to the website of Lost Horse Press, which is basically www.losthorsepress.org, one word. Then I don't have a website of my own, but if you Google me, my name is Carolyn, Carolyne, Wright, Wright, and if you just Google me, I think the Poetry Foundation website, the Poetry Magazine site is there, and you'll find a great deal about me.
Before we close, I just want to say it's been a pleasure to listen to the wealth of experience and travel in your life, and it's been wonderful to hear your poems. It's also been wonderful to hear the history of who you studied with and how that all worked out, starting with your days at Seattle U and continuing at the University of Washington. So thank you very, very much for the instruction, for the poetry, and for all your efforts on behalf of women and poetry. Thanks, Carolyn.
Well, thank you so much, Sheila. We'll talk again at some point.
I know we will.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to In Conversation, Discussions on Writing and the Writing Life with Sheila Bender. For more of Sheila's interviews, please go to Sheila's website, www.writingitreal.com/audio.
In Conversation